Why is it that we spend so much of our lives trying to fix, fight, and reshape everything around us? The weather is never quite right. The people never behave as they should. The world always in crisis. And so we hustle harder, speak louder, plan more, and push endlessly, chasing some fragile idea of how things should be. It's almost noble, isn't it? This desire to make things better, to create change, to do good. But buried inside that noble urge is something most of us never stop to question. A quiet assumption that the world is broken, and that it's our job to fix it. That assumption, innocent as it seems, is the seed of so much suffering. We grow up believing that control equals safety, that if we can just make the world behave, we'll finally be at peace. We try to fix people, to love us, to stay, to change. We try to fix society, to agree with us, to follow our path, to obey our vision. We even try to fix life itself, to never age, never fail, never feel pain. But the truth is simple and deeply uncomfortable. The world doesn't bend to our will. It never has, it never will. And yet, we pour so much of our time, our energy, our spirit into that very illusion. In Buddhism, there's a word, dukkha, a word that doesn't just mean suffering, but more precisely, the dissatisfaction we feel when reality doesn't match our expectations. That feeling when someone disappoints you, that tension when life doesn't go your way, that quiet war we wage every day against what is, it's dukkha, and it's fueled not by the world being wrong, but by our refusal to accept it as it is. You see, the world has never promised you comfort. It has never sworn loyalty to your plans. It simply moves like the wind, like the tides, like time itself. And still we resist it. We yell at the wind, we curse the rain, we demand permanence in a world built on change. And when change comes, we call it failure. When people leave, we call it betrayal. When life shifts, we call it chaos. But is it? Or are we simply afraid of letting go? Let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to carry the weight of the world? To feel like you have to solve everything, fix everything, control everything. And yet, we wear that exhaustion like a badge of honor. We say, I'm trying to make a difference. But are we really? Or are we just terrified of stillness? Terrified of facing what's inside when all the noise of fixing the world finally goes quiet? There's an ancient Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. It sounds simple, almost mundane, but hidden inside is a wisdom deeper than most philosophies ever reach. It means the enlightened don't escape life. They don't control life. They don't change the world. They simply return to the present, to clarity, to peace, not by conquering the world, but by conquering the illusion that they ever needed to. Maybe the real battle was never out there. Maybe it was always within. Maybe the world doesn't need more people trying to control it. Maybe it needs more people willing to understand themselves. Because what if the storms outside were just reflections of storms inside? What if peace was never about changing the weather, but learning how to stand in the rain? And that brings us here, to a moment, a pause, a question. What if you stopped trying to fix everything? What if for once you stopped trying to change the world and started listening to the part of you that's been begging for silence? Not silence out there, silence in here, because the truth is, no one has ever truly changed the world without first changing themselves. And some don't even need to change the world. They just change, and the world follows. And now, as we step deeper into this path, we begin to question everything we've ever believed about suffering, struggle, and change. Not by escaping the world, but by seeing clearly where it all begins. Not out there, but in the mind. We think the pain comes from outside. The job we lost, the words they said, the silence they gave, the chaos on the news, the traffic on the street, the endless scroll of things going wrong. But here's the quiet truth most never dare to face. The world is not the cause of our suffering. Our mind is. Not the world as it is, but the world as we believe it should be. Every moment our mind is writing a silent script. They should treat me better. I must succeed. This shouldn't be happening. And every time life refuses to play along, we suffer, not because life is cruel, but because it dared to be different than the version we imagined. Buddhism calls this tanha craving, not just craving for pleasure or possessions, but craving for control, for certainty, for reality to fit neatly inside our expectations. And when it doesn't, we resist, we cling, we fight shadows in our own mind. Buddha didn't teach suffering as punishment. He revealed it as a map, a pointer, a mirror. Suffering shows us where we're still holding on, still identifying, still confusing what's happening with who we are. Imagine this. Two people walk through the same rainstorm. One curses the sky. The other simply lifts their face and smiles. Same world, different mind. We live in a culture that rewards reaction. Feel something, post it. Hurt, blame, angry, destroy, confused, escape. But the Buddha walked a different path. One of looking deeply into the roots of suffering, not its symptoms. He didn't say, fix the world. He said, know the mind. Because when you see your thoughts clearly, when you stop treating them as truth and start seeing them as passing clouds, you begin to wake up. Think of the mind like a lake. When the water is turbulent, you can't see anything beneath it. But when the waves settle, the truth appears. Most of us are trying to change the wind, but the wise learn how to still the waters. There's an ancient parable. A man is shot with an arrow. Instead of pulling it out, he starts shouting, "Who shot me? Why did they do it? Was the arrow poisoned? Was it personal?" And while he's caught in questions, he bleeds. We do this too. We get hurt, and instead of healing, we spiral. We analyze, we relive, we retell the story again and again until it becomes our identity. But suffering doesn't live in the moment itself. It lives in the replay. Here's a secret. Pain is inevitable, but suffering, that's optional. The mind makes the difference. So many are seeking peace through rearranging the world. But what if the world was never the problem? What if you could sit in the same life, the same body, the same chaos, but experience it differently? That's not magic, that's awareness. And awareness doesn't require control, it requires presence. We spend our lives running from discomfort, distracting ourselves, filling every quiet second with noise, screens, stimulation. But the discomfort is not in the moment. It's in our mind's resistance to the moment. The root of suffering isn't the world, it's the thought, this should not be happening. Remove that thought, and even difficulty becomes spacious. Even heartbreak becomes sacred. Even chaos becomes stillness. The Buddha didn't offer a religion. He offered a tool, a mirror to see the mind clearly. And in that seeing, to be free, not free from life, free within it. Have you ever noticed how obsessed we are with fixing things? The system is broken. The world is unjust. People are wrong. Something must be done. So we rally, we protest, we shout, we argue. We convince ourselves that if we just keep fighting long enough, loud enough, smart enough, everything will finally fall into place. But it never does, because what we're really chasing are shadows. From the moment we wake up, the mind starts building a checklist. Things to improve, things to fix, things that need to be better. It sounds productive, it feels noble, but have you ever wondered, where does it end? The to-do list of the world is infinite, and the more we fix, the more broken things seem to become. We've been conditioned to believe that our value comes from what we change. That making a difference means altering the world outside of us, and so we build identities out of missions. We become saviors, reformers, influencers, leaders, but here's the hard truth. If you build your peace on the idea that things must change, you'll never know peace, because the world doesn't stop shifting. This doesn't mean we ignore suffering. It doesn't mean we don't act, but there's a difference, a radical difference between acting from wisdom and reacting from restlessness. Think of the mind as a torch in a dark cave. Wherever you point it, the shadows seem to move. So you chase them. Swing the light faster, get more anxious. But the shadows aren't your enemy. They're a reflection, and the cave, it's your own mind. There's a Zen story. A man sees a snake in his room and panics. He screams, runs out, doesn't sleep all night. The next morning he returns with a stick ready to fight. But as the sunlight enters, he sees clearly it was just a rope. This is how most of us live, reacting to ropes like they are snakes, fighting illusions, fixing ghosts, exhausted, confused, angry but never free. Fixing the world can become a beautiful excuse. an excuse to never look within. As long as the problem is out there, we never have to face what's in here. But no revolution has ever healed the human heart. No social movement has erased insecurity, fear, or craving. And no matter how much we organize the outside, if we don't understand the inside, suffering finds a way to return. It always does. You've seen it. People who seem to have it all, success, fame, influence, yet are consumed by anxiety and emptiness, or the activists who burn themselves out, not from injustice but from inner imbalance. When your entire being is built around what must change, you begin to lose sight of what already is. You forget how to be still, how to be present, how to simply be. Here's something that might feel uncomfortable to hear. The world doesn't need you to fix it, not in the way you think. It needs you to wake up, to stop chasing shadows, to stop fighting ghosts, to return to what's real, what's silent, what's already whole within you, because when you act from that space, your presence heals more than your plans ever could. We weren't born to carry the world. We were born to remember who we are within it. And maybe, just maybe, it's not about doing more, but about seeing more clearly, seeing that what we've been chasing all this time was never broken, only misunderstood, and so the journey continues, not deeper into the noise, but deeper into the quiet, into the space where true transformation begins, not by chasing, but by stopping, not by fixing, but by seeing. And in that stillness, something ancient stirs, something the mind can't explain, but the heart has always known. We spend so much time looking out, watching, judging, fixing. The world becomes our obsession, but the question we rarely ask is, what if the real work was never out there? What if it was always in here? There comes a moment, quiet, unexpected, when the outer noise becomes too much and you realize you're not exhausted by the world, you're exhausted by your reaction to it. And so, for the first time, you turn inward, not to escape, not to run away, but to finally meet yourself, without the armor, without the story, without the need to fix or fight, just to see. This is the beginning of real change, not the change that comes from effort, but the change that comes from seeing clearly. Buddhist practice doesn't ask you to be better, it asks you to wake up, to look at the mind, not judge it, not silence it, but to see it as it is, because once seen, it begins to transform on its own. Imagine a mirror, perfectly still. It doesn't choose what it reflects, it simply reveals. This is awareness. It doesn't argue with reality, it doesn't push or pull, it just sees. And in that seeing, the illusion begins to fall apart. You start noticing the little patterns, the tightness in your chest when someone disagrees, the voice in your head that always demands more, the quiet fear that says, I'm not enough. You see how quickly you react, how often you cling, how rarely you rest in the moment without needing to change it. You begin to notice the suffering not as punishment, but as a signal, like smoke that leads you to the fire. One moment you're in a conversation, someone says something sharp, old you would fire back, defend, attack, collapse, but now you pause, you notice the heat rising, but you don't feed it. You see the story forming, but you don't believe it. And in that pause, freedom begins. Awareness is not passive. It's not doing nothing. It's the most active form of stillness there is, because in awareness, you're not avoiding the world, you're facing it fully, with your eyes open, your heart steady, and your reactions no longer running the show. The Buddha didn't promise an easier life. He promised clarity, and clarity changes everything. Because when you stop living in reaction, you start living in truth. Not in the stories the mind tells, but in the spaciousness underneath them. There's a saying in the Zen tradition, enlightenment is intimacy with all things. That intimacy doesn't come from control, it comes from seeing, from dropping the filters, the resistance, the judgment, and simply being present with what is. You begin to see the patterns of your own mind not as enemies, but as old survival mechanisms, attempts to protect, to control, to belong, and instead of fighting them, you bow to them, thank them, and let them go. This is real transformation, not changing who you are, but shedding who you're not, peeling away the masks, the false selves, the heavy stories you've carried for too long, and underneath it all you find something unexpected. Not a perfect person, not a spiritual warrior, but a human, still, soft, and profoundly awake. In the mirror of awareness, you begin to remember that the world doesn't need a more polished version of you. It needs the real you, the present you, the you who's no longer lost in thought, but rooted in being. And that is how change begins, not through force, not through resistance, but through the simple, radical act of seeing. So we keep walking, not to escape the world, but to understand it more deeply by understanding ourselves. And as that understanding deepens, something beautiful happens. We no longer need to chase peace. We become it. Not everything needs your opinion. Not every moment needs your reaction. And not every storm needs to be fought. We're taught to respond, to have something to say, to defend, explain, argue, improve. But what if the most powerful act is not what you do, but what you don't do? What if true transformation begins in stillness? Most of us are caught in a loop, a cycle of triggers and reactions. Someone says something unkind, we snap. The traffic is bad, we curse. Our expectations break, so we blame. Reaction feels normal, it feels justified. It even feels necessary, but the truth is, reaction is rarely about the present. It's old pain, old patterns, old wounds, still trying to prove something. Buddhism doesn't ask you to suppress your emotions. It invites you to observe them, to see the spark, before it becomes a wildfire, because every moment of reactivity is a moment of unconsciousness, and every moment of awareness is a chance to choose peace over pattern. There's a story about the Buddha. One day a man came to insult him. He shouted, accused, did everything he could to provoke a reaction, but the Buddha simply listened. Then calmly he asked, if someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The man was speechless, because in that moment, the Buddha showed something most of us forget. You don't have to receive what the world throws at you. You can witness, you can breathe, you can let it pass like clouds in a wide sky. Non-reaction is not weakness. It is strength refined into wisdom. It is the warrior who no longer needs to draw the sword, the ocean that no longer trembles at the wind, the tree that stands tall while the storm passes. When you no longer react to everything, you begin to see clearly. You begin to choose deliberately, not out of fear or anger or habit, but from a grounded presence. And in that space, you gain something no reaction ever gave you: freedom. We live in a world addicted to speed, to stimulation, to instant feedback. But peace isn't found in the reaction. It's found in the pause, in the sacred gap between stimulus and response. That gap is where your power lies, your clarity, your liberation. Think of a calm lake. Throw a stone and it ripples. Now imagine the lake so still, so vast, that the stone disappears without a sound. This is the power of non-reaction, not ignoring the world, but absorbing it with such depth that it no longer disturbs your peace. You begin to realize you don't need to fix every misunderstanding. You don't need to prove your worth in every argument. You don't need to participate in every drama. Sometimes your silence says more than 1,000 words. Sometimes your stillness shifts more than 1,000 actions. And here's the paradox. When you stop reacting, people around you start to change, not because you force them, but because your calm becomes contagious. You become a mirror, reflecting without judgment, a refuge, not because you offer solutions, but because you offer presence. Non-reaction is not about shutting down, it's about opening up to a deeper space within yourself, a space where you are no longer controlled by anger, by fear, by the need to be right. A space where peace isn't something you chase, it's something you are. So the next time you feel the urge to react, pause, breathe, notice, ask yourself, what part of me is being triggered? What would happen if I just watched? And in that pause, you might find something unexpected. The moment passes, the world keeps turning, and you remain still, untouched, free. No need to say much now, only truth resting in awareness. In this stillness, you begin to understand. You are no longer a slave to the world's noise. You are the quiet it never expected. And that quiet changes everything. Shall we continue? Because ahead lies another illusion, that the enlightened must save the world. But what if true wisdom knows there is nothing to save, only something to see? The awakened one does not set out to change the world. The awakened one becomes the change no world can ignore. We've all been fed the same story. The enlightened must do something, speak louder, stand up, lead the charge, be the hero. We imagine spiritual awakening as a call to action, marching into the chaos with wisdom as our sword. But what if that story is just another form of ego? What if the idea of being a savior is the last illusion we must let go? You see, the mind is clever. Even as it seeks truth, it quietly wants to matter. It whispers, "You are awakened now, you must guide others, you must fix the world." It feels noble, it feels right. But beneath that holy mask is often the same old craving to be important, to be heard, to be needed. The Buddha did not run for office. He did not start a movement. He did not wage a war against injustice. He sat beneath a tree and faced his own mind. He didn't shout, he saw. And in that seeing, he ended suffering not out there, but in here. True enlightenment does not fuel the ego, it dissolves it. It doesn't scream for change. It radiates stillness so vast that change happens naturally in its presence. You don't need to convince the world when you become living proof that peace is possible. There's a deep misunderstanding today that the wise must be loud, that the spiritual must be activists. But activism and awakening are not the same thing. Activism often comes from anger, from urgency, from the belief that something is wrong and must be corrected. Awakening comes from clarity, from stillness, from the realization that suffering begins in the mind and nowhere else. Does that mean the awakened do nothing? Not quite. It means they no longer act from agitation. They act from presence. They no longer seek to rescue the world. They simply stop adding to its chaos. And in that quiet refusal to react, they become a silent revolution. Think of a candle in a dark room. It does not fight the darkness. It does not preach to it. It does not organize a campaign. It simply burns. And in doing so, it reveals what was always there. Many have tried to save the world. Few have tried to understand themselves. And yet, the deepest transformation always begins in the mirror. If you clean the mirror, the reflection changes on its own. But try to scrub the reflection directly. You'll only smear the image further. The enlightened are not saviors. They are reminders. Reminders of what is possible when the mind is free from illusion, when the heart is free from striving. They offer no slogans, no ideologies, no enemies, only presence. When you are no longer driven by the need to fix, you start to see with different eyes. You don't divide the world into victims and villains. You see suffering behind both. You don't choose sides. You transcend sides. You don't impose peace. You embody it. And here's the strange beauty of it all. When you stop needing to change the world around you begins to change, not because you force it, but because your presence is no longer part of the problem. You don't need to be a hero. You don't need to save anyone. You just need to wake up. And that is more powerful than 1,000 marches, because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more clarity, not more saviors, but more souls who have remembered who they are. The world tells you, change the system, but the Buddha whispers, change your mind. And when the mind is free, there is nothing left to save, only something left to love. There comes a moment in every seeker's path when the noise outside no longer matters, because the storm inside has grown louder. We fight, not just the world, but ourselves, our thoughts, our emotions, our memories. We wake up already at war, with our imperfections, with our past, with what should have been, what could have been. But what if the real path was not about fighting better, but about finally letting go? Letting go is not weakness. It's not resignation. It's not giving up. It's waking up. It's realizing that all this time we've been wrestling shadows, arguing with ghosts, and calling it progress. We cling to stories that hurt us. We rehearse old wounds. We replay regrets like broken records, as if pain, repeated enough, might somehow redeem us. But it doesn't. It only keeps the war alive. You are not your guilt. You are not your shame. You are not the voice in your head that says you're not enough. That voice is a habit, a pattern, a recording. It's the echo of a mind that never learned silence, but beneath it, there is space, there is stillness, there is you, Letting go doesn't mean forgetting, it means forgiving, not because they deserve it, not because the past disappears, but because you do not need to carry it anymore. Imagine holding a burning coal, fists clenched in rage, and someone tells you, "Drop it." You say, "But look what they did to me." They say yes, and you're still burning. Letting go is not for them, it's for you. The inner war ends when you stop needing to win, when you realize you were never your thoughts, never your wounds, never your image. You were always the sky, not the clouds, always the witness, never the storm, but we forget. We mistake turbulence for truth, emotion for identity, pain for meaning. The awakened don't stop suffering because they fix the world. They stop suffering because they no longer resist what is. They breathe, they feel, and they release over and over again until there's nothing left to hold on to except the present moment. There is a kind of peace that doesn't come from solving everything. It comes when you no longer need to. Letting go is not passive. It is the most active choice you can make. To stop feeding the fire, to put down the sword, to walk away from the battlefield within, not in defeat, but in awakening. The great masters didn't transcend the world. They stopped clinging to it. They lived simply, spoke gently, moved lightly, not because they didn't feel, but because they no longer feared. They didn't need to control anything because nothing controlled them. We all carry bags filled with invisible stones. Old grudges, old roles, old identities, each one heavy with memory. Letting go is setting them down, not because they are gone, but because we no longer need to carry their weight. Can you feel that? That breath when the burden leaves your shoulders. That is the beginning of peace. The path isn't about becoming more, it's about needing less. Not proving you're worthy, but realizing you always were. Not changing the story, but stepping out of it. And when the war ends inside, you begin to see the world differently. Less as a battlefield, more as a garden, something to tend, not to conquer. This is the turning point, from struggle to surrender, from force to flow. The inner war was never necessary, but the pain it brought taught us where peace truly lies. Not in control, not in perfection, but in letting go. There is a moment, right after the storm ends inside you, when something strange happens. The world begins to soften, not because it changed, but because you did. We often imagine that influence requires volume, louder voices, stronger opinions, bigger movements, but the deepest change doesn't make noise. It doesn't demand attention. It radiates quietly, like the sun doesn't shout to make flowers bloom. It simply shines. The enlightened ones never try to change the world. They change themselves. But in doing so, they became a mirror, a presence so steady, so grounded, that those around them couldn't help but shift, not through debate, not through force, but through being. Presence is power. Have you ever stood next to someone deeply peaceful? They don't even need to speak. And yet you feel different, calmer, clearer, more alive. That's the kind of influence that doesn't ask. It invites. It doesn't preach. It reflects. You don't need to save the world. You only need to stop contributing to its chaos. When your words no longer come from fear, your silence begins to teach. When your actions are rooted in awareness, your stillness becomes a revolution. The truth is, most of us were never taught how powerful our being is. We thought influence came from titles, followers, commands. But true transformation begins in subtle shifts. When you stop reacting, others notice. When you move through conflict with calm, others pause. When you walk in integrity with no need to prove or correct, your very presence becomes a lighthouse. No fanfare, no performance, just light. We were trained to be loud, to convince, to fix others, but we were never asked, what if your silence heals more than your words? The awakened are not passive, they are simply rooted, deep like mountains, soft like water. And that combination of strength and surrender rearranges the world around them. You don't teach people by pointing out their faults. You teach by embodying what wholeness looks like, by walking without blame, by loving without attachment, by choosing peace again and again until others start to wonder, what makes them so still when the world is on fire? And in that wondering, a seed is planted, not by pressure, but by presence. This is the paradox. You stop needing to influence anything, and that's when you influence everything. Because nothing is more contagious than someone who is free, not flashy, not flawless, just free. Free from needing to win, free from needing to control, free from needing to be anything but real. And in that freedom, others remember their own. We spend so much time trying to convince others. But what if the most powerful statement you could ever make was how peacefully you carry yourself? What if the world didn't need another voice arguing, but another soul radiating clarity? The Buddha never marched. He sat, he walked, he lived simply. And yet the ripples of his being still move through the world 500 years later. Why? Because he became the change we all ache to see, not through effort, through embodiment. You don't need to light every candle, just become one, and those ready to awaken will find their way to your flame. So as you move forward, ask not how to fix the world, but how to walk through it with grace. Let your inner peace be your protest. Let your joy be your quiet rebellion, and let your freedom be the seed that awakens others without a word spoken. There's something we rarely admit. We swing between extremes not because we're sure, but because we're afraid. Afraid to pause, afraid to be still, afraid that if we don't fight for something, we stand for nothing, so we rush. We rebel, we chase ideals, we burn ourselves out trying to become something greater. But the awakened walk a different path. They walk the middle way, not too tight, not too loose, not indulgence, not denial, just balance. A quiet wisdom that doesn't scream to be heard. A presence that doesn't rush to prove itself. It doesn't pull away from life, nor does it get lost in it. It simply meets life, exactly where it is. You see, the world trains us to live in extremes, to choose sides, to declare war on what we don't understand. But the Buddha saw through this trap. He didn't teach us to escape the world, nor to fix it by force. He offered something far more radical. Be here, be aware, be still, and in that stillness, clarity arises. The middle way is not lukewarm. It's not indecisive, it's precise, quiet, effortless like a dancer in flow. Each step measured, each move conscious, never too much, never too little. It doesn't require a mission, it is the message. You don't need to become someone extraordinary. You only need to become fully present, because in presence, extremes dissolve. The craving for perfection fades, the need to be right dissolves, and suddenly there is just this breath, this moment, this life unfolding. Most of our suffering comes not from what happens, but from how we cling to what happens. We grip onto ideals, we attach to identities. We fight reality in the name of meaning. But the middle way walks past both pleasure and pain without rejecting either. It sees beauty in the rising and the falling. It lets go again and again, not to become passive, but to become truly free. True balance doesn't mean you feel nothing. It means you're not ruled by what you feel. It means joy doesn't carry you away, and sorrow doesn't drown you. It means you meet life with open hands, not clenched fists. There is no hero's journey to complete, no enemy to conquer, no savior's crown waiting at the end of your effort. Just this simple truth. When you stop chasing extremes, the middle way reveals itself, and it's been here all along. In your breath, in your walk, in your silence, in your unspoken, unshaken presence. The world will try to convince you, pick a side, take a stand, be louder, be stronger, be more. But the middle way whispers, be still, be clear, be free. Not because you gave up, but because you woke up. No more running toward enlightenment as if it's somewhere far away. No more condemning the world for not matching your expectations. Just walking, breathing, letting go, and realizing that peace doesn't arrive after the storm. It's what remains when you stop fueling the storm within. This is the quiet revolution, the invisible path, not built by effort, but discovered in surrender. You no longer need to seek perfection, or save the world, or prove your worth. Just walk the middle way, and let the world watch what it looks like. When someone no longer lives in reaction, but in presence. He didn't shout, he didn't fight, he didn't gather crowds or raise flags, he simply sat under a tree, and there in stillness he let go of the war inside, let go of the self that clung, craved, and feared. Let go of the need to fix the world, because he saw it was his mind that needed healing first. He didn't ask the world to follow, but it did. Not because of charisma, not because of power, but because of the silence, the one that carried truth without a single word. This was the Buddha, but not a myth, not a statue, not a story bound to history. No, the Buddha was a man who simply stopped running, and maybe that's how it's always been. The ones who truly change the world don't start by changing the world. They start by changing themselves, by meeting their own suffering with such clarity, such presence, that the suffering could no longer survive. You won't find their names on all the headlines. They may never trend, but if you sit with them, you feel it, a stillness, a gravity, a quiet that softens everything around it, because peace is contagious. Not the kind that demands silence, but the kind that inspires it. They didn't need to convince. They embodied truth. They didn't force change. They became change, and in doing so, they reminded us all that maybe, just maybe, we've been looking outward, when the real revolution was always inward. You don't need to become a guru. You don't need to renounce the world. You just need to pause and see that the source of all your battles, your striving, your restlessness, was never out there. It was here, in the mind that couldn't sit still, in the heart that didn't know how to let go. But now, you know, you've walked the path from control to surrender, from reaction to awareness, from fixing the world to facing yourself. Not as escape, not as retreat, but as liberation. The kind that ripples outward without effort, without noise. You are not here to fight everything. You are here to see clearly. And in that seeing, your presence begins to heal. Not just you, but everyone around you. So breathe. Not for control, not for progress, but for presence. And in that presence, you may discover what the Buddha discovered under that tree. Peace is not found by changing the world, but by changing how you meet the world. Let this be your revolution. Silent, steady, unshakable. You don't need to change the world. Change yourself, and the world will follow, without force, without fame, without a single word spoken. Just like the one who sat under the tree, if this resonated with something deep inside you, if even a small part of you felt seen, understood, or simply still, then know you're not alone on this path. There are many walking quietly just like you. And if you wish to keep walking with us through teachings that don't preach but invite, then gently consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here we don't chase answers, we sit with the questions. And if you choose to stay, we're honored to walk beside you. Until then, may your days be simple, your heart be light, and your presence deep.